I just got back from a home inspection here in Ottawa where we found something that could cost somebody a lot of money. And it really got me thinking that, we have buyers that have no idea what the real deal breakers are in home inspections until they're already in trouble. And we're in a balanced market right now in Ottawa, so buyers have time to do diligence. They have time to do inspections. That means you have room to ask questions, to bring in specialists, and to negotiate on these things. So these are 10 things that I think you need to look out for when you're in the process of buying a home. But before we get into that, hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps push these videos to other people who are just like you, who are in the process of potentially doing the research to buy a home here in Ottawa. My name is Jimmy. I'm a real estate agent here in Ottawa. I've been an agent in Ottawa for over 15 years, and there is a link in the description to book a call with me. Whether you're thinking about buying, selling, or you'd like to just chat about the market, you can find that down below. Okay, let's get into this. So just getting back from that inspection, and what we found on that inspection is why I wanted to make this video. Most buyers lose money on like the big stuff. It's not the sticky windows or the loose doorknobs, the small little things that are just part of a home. They're the things, those are the things that aren't going to ruin your financing once you move in. Or those small things aren't the ones that are going to turn your new home into a big renovation that you really didn't budget for. So here are the 10 deal breakers I come across in home inspections, what to look for and what to know about. So the first one is foundation issues. And not all foundations are the same, and not all foundation cracks, which is what we often see, are the same. There are different kinds. So let's talk about some of the main ones. So small vertical hairline cracks, those are actually pretty darn common. You see those quite often, and they're not usually a major concern. What you should be watching for during your inspection are larger cracks and also horizontal cracks. What I want you to watch out for are horizontal cracks, the ones that are running from left to right, or maybe they're stair step cracks that are in block foundations, or maybe the walls of the foundation are bowing, meaning it looks like when you look at the wall on the side, you can almost see it bowing in. Those are different type of red flags than typical foundation cracks that can be repaired. And they're also signs of pressure and movement potentially. And that's a different conversation to be having with you and your home inspector. I've walked into basements before and seen a crack wide enough to fit my entire hand in. And I'd put my hand in just out of curiosity, but immediately pulled it back. Because you know that there's movement there, and just the thought of anything shifting when your hand in there scared the crap out of me. But that is an example that's not a small crack. That is most likely pointing toward a structural problem in the home. Now, if it's a poured foundation crack, which is what your agent can tell you, your home inspector can tell you what kind of foundation it is, those with a minor crack, let's say, or some water seeping or some effervescence on the foundation, well, there are companies that can inject and seal those cracks for a few $1,000s. I've had clients do them. It's not that significant of a cost. It's also not that significant of work to be held up. Well, if you have a block foundation with cracks, well, all of a sudden those can be harder to work with because you might fix one crack in one space, but then there's another space in an area and water might have the ability to get through there. There's so many potential entry points in block foundations that they just make it a little bit harder to work with, and also meaning there might be more costs involved with repairing those kind of foundations. Another foundation is a stone foundation. Now, overall, stone foundations are quite strong and have a good reputation of lasting long. It just means there's more upkeep in maintaining those stone foundations. So if you're looking at, let's say, repointing, which is the mortar in between the stones, well, that can cost more, and that also might mean more upkeep. There's also more entry points for water to be able to penetrate that foundation, similar to a block foundation. And the biggest concern about stone foundations is that if the foundation has reached the end of its life, lifting the house and replacing it entirely, that's not just a simple repair. That is a massive project and something that your inspector should flag in your report. If your inspector flags foundation movement, bring in a structural engineer before you do anything else. Get a written assessment and maybe a quote, because if the seller won't cooperate, well, all of a sudden that might be your answer. So the next one is water intrusion. So water getting into a home is serious because it connects almost every other issue on this list. And the tricky part is that it's not always obvious to find where the water might be. In a basement, which is often where we commonly see it, you watch for, let's say, fresh paint on a section of the wall that's been changed. Sometimes there's staging around there, sometimes just concealment. Maybe it's white, chalky staining on the foundation walls. That could be effervescence, which isn't terribly, but it's also just pointing to evidence of moisture. And it doesn't mean that water is around the foundation. Now, maybe another thing is a dehumidifier has been running constantly. Maybe there's 2 dehumidifiers running constantly. That could be a sign that there is moisture at least. Maybe not water, but moisture. Maybe there's staining on the base of the drywall. Maybe there's storage cracks that are high on exterior walls. These are signs that are worth looking at and slowing down to ask your inspector more information on. Ask your inspector if they carry a moisture meter. A good inspector usually will run along the walls and tell you what's behind the surface before you ever have to open up, because this isn't like homes. During inspections, you do not get to open walls up and see what's behind them, but a moisture meter is a great way to sort of try and gauge if an area might have a water issue that isn't visible to the naked eye. And if moisture is flagged during your inspection, talk to the seller about it. See if they know anything. And if they're unaware, well, then maybe they've never known. But maybe if you're not getting the type of answers or the cooperation you want, then maybe it is something where the seller does know about it. They're just trying to get away with not telling you more. Another one to look out for is mold and mildew. Now, mold is an issue at first. Anyone with asthma or respiratory issues, respiratory sensitivities, this is a hard stop. Mold can seriously impact your health long-term while living in a home if you do not change or remediate the issue, especially if you don't know about it. Because the problem is you can't always see it. It could be growing behind walls, it could be under your floor, it could be inside a finished basement that looks phenomenal on the outside. All mold needs is a food source, which is wood, drywall, maybe some organic material, and then moisture. Basements are typically the most common place you see because it tends to hold more humidity. Maybe a basement has a musty smell and it's all finished, but you were unsure why it would be. Maybe there's a damp looking insulation. Maybe there's some staining edges on the drywall in some areas like in storerooms or some other spots in the basement that are not as used. Those are worth a second look, and to have your inspector give you as best information that they can, thinking, could there be something behind there? And unfortunately, this is the hardest part about purchasing homes and buying real estate, is that for mold, you might never know. One of the most common areas is the basement, but also in showers where maybe water has penetrated behind the tile. I personally experienced that in my own home. Is when I bought my home. There was a shower that when we renovated the shower fairly soon after moving in, we found mold growing on the drywall behind it, and that had spread to another part of the room. So it was pretty scary, but overall we were able to fix it, make sure that the water was taken care of, and get a bathroom that made sense. But it is something that you want to at least explore and investigate as best you can without worrying that it could be everywhere. Another one is electrical hazard. So bad wiring, it does show up more often than you think, especially in older homes in Ottawa. Now the obvious ones are knob and tube wiring that are still active. Maybe it's an outdated panel that needs replacement. I've also walked into inspections where a junction box had been DIY worked on at some point by the previous owner, and they had wired in some random light fixture that had no business being there. And once you start seeing that and start pulling away the thread, you notice that they're doing it themselves. And then all of a sudden, what about the junction boxes? What about the breaker boxes? What about the rest of the electrical in the house? These are things that you might not always find during an inspection, but typically you can start noticing little signs that might lead you to ask more questions of the current homeowner. And in Ontario, if work has been done to the electrical, let's say it's a finished basement or there was a renovation, there should be an ESA certificate. That is the Electrical Safety Authority. And that means that a licensed inspector has signed off on the work. And if there's no ESA report and the work looks potentially questionable, like this breaker box that I saw, well, you want to bring in an electrician to make sure that the work was done is up to code. That's why it's important to ask the seller if they have an ESA certificate from the work that was done prior. A lot of the times sellers don't have one if there was, let's say, the seller had done it from a couple ownerships prior, but sometimes there are tags that are placed on the breaker box showing when the work was done. You can also contact the ESA, so the Electrical Safety Authority, and try to dig up the ESA certificate that was done with a previous owner. Another one is an outdated panel that has active knob and tube, and it isn't just a repair issue, that actually is a fire issue and an insurance issue. So active knob and tube wiring, you will not get home insurance for, so you need to be able to find which electrical lines are running that. Typically, it's some sort of like in an older house that has a line running up to a light in the attic. Maybe that was never noticed before. That might be something you have to change. It won't be the entire type of home. I made a video about knob and tube wiring in one of my previous videos on what to avoid for buying certain homes. You can check that out in my channel. Another one is aluminum wiring. Now that's not a red flag. That simply just means you need to make sure that the aluminum wiring was pigtailed prior to you buying the home, or make sure it's done by the seller or you in between the time you buy and you move in. Insurance companies will give you insurance for aluminum wiring, but it is at a very high premium. And in terms of safety, you might as well just get an electrician to pigtail all of the electrical. That way you're safe and your insurance company will give you a more favorable rate for home insurance. Knob and tube wiring, outdated panels, these aren't repair issues. They end up being fire hazards and insurance problems. Another problem you see in inspections is plumbing. So inside the house, what you're watching for are leaks, staining, evidence of repeated repairs, low water pressure, inconsistent flow. These are signs that something has been patched or repaired at some point more than once and may be on its way out. One inspection I was at, the cast iron drain was running across the ceiling horizontally from upstairs to downstairs, and it was starting to corrode. You could tell on the outside it was starting to have a problem. The other side of this is your sewer that runs from your house to the street. In older Ottawa homes, that pipe is often clay or cast iron, and it could be impacted by tree roots that have broken it down, that could lead to issues in your yard and backing up of plumbing. Now, one way you can find out about this is running a sewer scope, and it costs about $1,000 to get a plumber in there to send in a camera down to make sure your line is exactly what is there. Not all homes need this. You only really need this if you feel there is an issue that has come up during your inspection, that you're concerned about the line running from your house to the city sewer. That's where asking the right questions about your plumbing, whether they've had backups in the past, is an important one to ask before your inspection, so you know of the issues that the seller had experienced, so you have a better understanding of telling your inspector what has happened, so that they have a better knowledge of maybe what they're walking into. Roof damage is a big thing we see in inspections, and most buyers, honestly, they look at shingles and sort of move on. The attic is really where a lot of the answers are. So active leaks with damaged shingles, maybe there's water staining on the sheathing, maybe there's staining on the drywall ceiling on the upper level, maybe there's even sagging roof lines in between the trusses, signs of repeated patching, different color shingles. These are obvious ones that you can see on the outside. But attic condensation and poor ventilation, these are just as important and quite frankly easier to miss. Your inspector should have a ladder go up into the attic, even if it's an attic hatch. They should go in there, inspect the installation, look at the sheathing to make sure that you're not seeing mold, water issues, staining, anything that would be off that you wouldn't expect, because you're not often expected to go into the attic, but you need your inspector to take photos of it up there so you have a better understanding of what you're walking into. And a big thing about attics is if it's unused and if the ventilation is off, well, that's where moisture can build up, especially when you have a bathroom vent fan that might be running from the bathroom on the second floor up to the vent on the outside. A lot of times that tube can fall off from the vent that's attached to the roof, and all of a sudden you're just venting that hot, warm air from your shower into your attic. And you want to make sure that line is attached and make sure there's no issues coming from the venting fan in your bathroom. Because if you get a moisture buildup and moisture in the attic, unfortunately that does lead to mold, usually on the sheathing. And it also weighs down your insulation depending on the kind you have up there. Ice damming is another one to mention here as well. Poor insulation in roofs and ventilation as well. It can lead the attic to cause heat to escape. Snow melts above it and then it refreezes below it. That's where you get water backups under the shingles, because when the water melts but there's ice on top, it has to go somewhere, so it runs under the shingles, through the sheathing, into your attic. So you end up with water damage that's inside the house and up from the roof. Replacing the shingles on a roof, that can run anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 depending on the size and challenge of the home. A roof is a really big, expensive item, and it's one thing that you want to make sure you know what you're buying. And so if the roof is on its end of life cycle, that is definitely something you want to bring up with the seller to make sure they're aware of it and to bring that into your negotiation before you sign on the final dotted line. Now, one of the more minor things that pops up is poor drainage and grading around the house. And this one looks sort of minor on the surface, which is why a lot of times when you're doing a home inspection, it's often not really noticed, but it isn't always minor. So grading just means the land slopes away from the foundation on the outside. So you think of the house here, the grading's down here. So the ground should slope away from the home so water drains outward and doesn't go toward the house. Because if it grades toward the home, well, anytime there's a heavy rain or a spring thaw, you're having water tending toward the foundation. So these simple grading issues are fixable and are not expensive. If the house sits on a low point of the lot, well, then that's a different problem because you can't necessarily fix that easily. Water is always going to move toward the easiest direction by default. That affects your foundation, it affects your basement, it affects your drainage, everything in terms of water reduction. Your inspector should flag that so you know what you're dealing with and then price that into your conversation if needed. This one's challenging, which is asbestos. Now, asbestos was used in home construction up until around 1984. It was used in a lot of things. So if you're buying anything that's built before that, it's worth knowing that it can show up in your home. The most common place to find asbestos is in insulation around heating systems and older pipes. Usually when you see heating vents that have this white material wrapped around it, that's considered an insulating product that had asbestos used as a binding material. Now that's relatively visible. Sometimes you can be in the basement, you look up and you can see the heating vents and it has this white material around it. You could hire a company to come in, they take that down properly to make sure there are no health concerns when it's removed. But there are other types of asbestos in a home that aren't as noticeable. It shows up in popcorn ceilings or drywall joint compound, which makes those harder to spot because those aren't the things that sort of scream, this is an issue. But the one thing to know about asbestos, if it's undisturbed, it's generally not an immediate risk. The problem is when you're renovating or maybe making a repair. So if you're planning to, let's say, open walls or make a change into the ceiling and you do own an older home and you're worried that maybe asbestos could be present in the drywall or in the popcorn of the ceiling, you want to have an abatement done prior to the work to make sure that there's not going to be any asbestos fibers being broke into and put into the air of your home. Vermiculite insulation is another one where asbestos can be found. It's not always there, but it can be. So if you're doing a home inspection and your home inspector says there is vermiculite insulation, vermiculite is fine, but you have to have it tested to find out if there is asbestos in it. So if it comes back positive, then the entire insulation has to be taken out and has to be replaced by a licensed abatement asbestos company, which adds time and money to your home buying process. So just know before you buy. And if a seller won't allow testing or won't cooperate on the remediation of it, well, that is an act of concern that you want to deal with in your negotiations before you decide to move forward on the home. Other issues are HVAC systems and sometimes oil tanks. So in Ottawa, we have to have heating. Heat is not optional. Winters here are real, and having a failing furnace isn't a comfort issue, it is honestly a safety issue. My furnace failed in the middle of winter because I left it one extra year. It was running on 20 years of life expectancy, and I should have replaced it the prior year. I didn't, and I paid the price to have it replaced at an emergency basis in the middle of February. Something I paid extra money to make sure that was done, not something I would recommend other people go through. An older HVAC system, which means your heating and cooling, they're not necessarily deal breakers of its own, especially if they've been regularly maintained and serviced. Your inspector should flag that in its report, meaning that that's going to be a cost that you're going to have to undertake at some point in the near future. Furnace replacement can run anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000+ depending on the product that you need for your home. So it's something you want to know ahead of time before you buy this house, because it can be one of those larger repair cost items. And many times when you find out the furnace is older, you can ask the seller to help pay for a portion of that repair. I've personally asked sellers to reduce their price by $2,500, $5,000 to help cover the cost of what this new furnace or AC might run. Now, oil tanks, that is an entirely different conversation. If the house has an oil furnace with an oil tank, it's very visible. You will see it right away when it's downstairs. That whole system needs to come out because it is done. The tank needs to be drained, it needs to be cut in half, it needs to be removed and disposed of properly. Now that's $5,000 to $10,000+ just for the tank removal, depending. So those are the ones you want to know about, because you know no matter what, you're changing that. It is not a question of when, it is a question of how much will it cost you. Now occasionally you'll come across potential property that has an oil tank that's buried on the property. Sometimes a homeowner doesn't even know about this because it's been there for a long time. One way you can find it is every once in a while you might see a random pipe sticking out of the ground that nobody can explain what it is for. That doesn't necessarily mean that is a buried oil tank, but there are very rare cases where every once in a while an oil tank is buried on the property. And if you find this out after you move in, the remediation cost to remove that tank, to remove the contaminated soil, are significant. So you want to do your best possible work to find, one, if there's a pipe on the outside that's sticking up that could lead to evidence of an oil tank being buried, or two, if there's evidence of an old pipe sticking out of the foundation, which would have been the old intake line for the oil into a furnace down there. You would see these typically on homes that are older than 1940, and you would often see these pipes that you would have, they'd be connected to nothing, and you would sort of wonder what they might lead to. You won't find many homes that have buried oil tanks anymore, but they do exist in Ottawa. They're just quite hard to. Now the last one I want to talk about are pests. So we're talking mice, chipmunks, squirrels, raccoons, rats even. No matter how old or new your home is, there are always ways for animals to be able to get in if they want to, but you can mitigate it slightly to make sure that if they do get in, they don't stick around. Mice are the most common and the easiest to deal with relatively. So honestly, most houses, you have to assume that they have mice in them at some point. Now, maybe not actively, but maybe in the fall when it starts getting cold and they're looking for a warm place, they find a way into a basement where they can hide during the colder months of the winter. And also, mice can squeeze through gaps that you wouldn't believe how small they can get. So it's not about mouse proofing your home, it's just about mitigating the reasons why they would stay. And it's not so much one mouse is the issue. The issue you want to look for in an inspection is evidence of an ongoing problem. So droppings that are in a certain place of a large quantity and in patterns, areas where the homeowner clearly had not been looking. Now the problem with mouse droppings and other animal droppings is these are health hazards if left alone and if not cleaned and taken care of. And different sellers, quite frankly, have different thresholds for what they consider acceptable. I've been on inspections where we found large amounts of mouse droppings, and when we asked the seller about it, they didn't really seem concerned. They knew about it, but it wasn't something that made them think this is an issue. So it really depends on people's thresholds of what they consider acceptable or what they consider to be concerning. It's important to note that any house will have had a mouse at some point in its lifespan. It's whether or not that's an ongoing issue is the one you need to concern about. So there are your 10 deal breakers to watch for in a home inspection. It's your foundation, water intrusion, mold, electrical, plumbing, roof, drainage issues, asbestos, HVAC, and pests. None of these, quite frankly, are reasons to panic when you find them during an inspection, but all of them are reasons to take your time, ask questions, and find out if this is still an issue that you want to accept for this new home that you're about to buy. Just make sure you know exactly what you're buying before you sign. If you haven't seen my video on the types of homes you should be avoiding, link is in the channel below, and I'll see you on the next one.